Welcome to Away, a podcast for anyone looking for a secular approach to 12-step recovery. I'm your host, Stephanie Roberts. I'm an atheist who used Alcoholics Anonymous' 12 steps to recover from alcohol and cocaine addiction. This limited series podcast is meant to help those who want to use a 12-step program to recover from addiction without God. It may also be helpful to believers who wish to help newcomers who are struggling with the concept of God or are firmly atheists. As George Eliot wrote in Middlemarch, it is a narrow mind which cannot look at a subject from various points of view. Good morning. Welcome to episode 2 of Away. This is your host, Steph Roberts. And I thought we would dive right in today. It can be hard for me to find time during the day to record these. So I wanted to get going early. It's about 6:30 in the morning on Tuesday, December 11th, 2018. And we put our tree up last night and got a wreath because my husband's into all that stuff. I'm not, of course, but it makes him really happy, which makes me really happy. So I'm going to work out in about half an hour. I just wanted to get a second podcast underway so you can get a better idea of where we're going with this. And I'm going to start by diving in almost at the very beginning of the big book. I would say the foreword to the second edition is kind of the only foreword that matters for a few reasons. A, it gives a brief overview of the history of AA, how it came to be. And B, it was written in 1955. The first publication was 1939. By 1955, society had evolved somewhat, but not tremendously. We're still 9 years away from the Civil Rights Act being enacted. So we've changed, we're growing. And Bill goes on in the later 1950s to write more and more open-minded literature, which we will certainly look into. But we're still in a sort of antiquated place societally, I would say by this. In any case, keeping the context of time in mind always. That's the point. The very first sentence, since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Miracle. Is it literally a miracle? No. Does it make a lot of sense that one alcoholic talking to another would be incredibly powerful? It does make a lot of sense. Because when I talk to someone who has had the same problem as me, be it alcoholism, be it bipolar depression, be it an eating disorder, I know I can speak more freely in front of that person than I could in front of a quote-unquote normal person. When I get the sense that the person with whom I'm speaking has empathy, not just sympathy, but empathy for how I feel, it is a lot easier to open up and be honest. It's also a lot less embarrassing to reveal the things about which I feel ashamed. That's not to say I shouldn't feel some shame about some of those things, but going forward in the program, I'm going to need to open up and admit those things, and it's a lot easier to open up when I know the other person has done equally bad things or understands doing those kind of bad things, even if she's never done them herself. So is it a miracle? No. Does it make a lot of sense? Yes. Sorry, having my coffee. So move down to the bottom of that page. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience, following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of the day. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for a moral inventory, step 4, confession of personal defects, step 5, restitution to those harmed, step 9, helpfulness to others, step 12, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. For believers, that may be a necessary step. It was not for me, and it does not need to be for you. So from my perspective, you can just cross out the rest of that line. Helpfulness to others is the key once I've laid a foundation in sobriety. So I am not going to keep reading this whole story in the foreword to the second edition, but I do think it would behoove you to Google it and learn a little bit more about the characters here, the meeting, what they're talking about. There's some really fantastic information out there on how these two met, and more accurate than it is perhaps in the big book itself, which can tend to be a more romanticized version of history. The Oxford group is especially interesting to look at because it was deeply religious and rigid in its religious beliefs and did not make it. But it did play an important part in the beginnings of our program, so there has to be some gratitude, and I'll explain why. This story is about Bill Wilson and Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher was a good friend of his. And it can help to know the story in full because it sets up for the reader the context of the book, yet again. The time in which the book was written is important, as is the perspective of the writers. So we know that. So this gift that was first given to Bill wasn't exactly sobriety. It was the idea that putting faith into something else, something more powerful, could solve a seemingly insurmountable problem. It is important to remember that these men each had his own paradigm. So Ebby's experience, that's the guy who brings Bill the idea that he can get sober if he chooses a God. It's important to remember that these men each had his own paradigm, again. So Ebby's experience is really important because he brings to Bill not just the idea that dependence on a higher power is quote-unquote necessary to sobriety. He brings him that idea via the Oxford group, right? So as open-minded as Bill is and as resistant to God as he says he is in the beginning, the basic principles of AA are born of the tenets of the Oxford group. So I think it's really important to Google the tenets of the Oxford group, look up what they were all about. Ebby didn't ultimately stay sober. He was in and out, relapsing. So it certainly gave him a chance, the Oxford group, but it didn't give him lifelong sobriety. And Bill and his fellow travelers saw that. They understood that the rigidity of the definition of a higher power in the Oxford group was clearly not the answer. And that's true of many of the groups that had tried to promote and help people with abstinence in the past, too. So another good thing to look up would be the Washingtonians, which preceded Alcoholics Anonymous. There are a lot of movements that really tried and failed to help, and in big part, I think the writers understood this, it was because they were so religiously driven. So they were trying the best with what they had. I don't really want to spend an inordinate amount of time on the story now, but I suggest reading some of the history from reputable sources. Silkworth.net has some great information about the characters. But again, and I said this in episode 1, it isn't important just to review the history of AA and read more about it. I think to get a foothold in this book a little better. But the country, the climate of the country then. Once I began to read the book with the context of time firmly rooted in my mind, I was a lot less angered by it. I'm not a fan of the book as a whole, but my perspective is not without its own bias. I was raised in New York City in the 1980s and 90s in a non-practicing Episcopalian home. I was raised with liberal values, so I can't condemn these men for failures they were not yet, quote unquote, evolved enough to understand. Instead, I can use the knowledge I have to try to better understand them. That's actually kind of an important thing as you go forward in AA. Once you understand and acknowledge your own values and you've sort of cleared the fog enough to see, who am I really? What are my values really? You can use that newfound knowledge and understanding and evolution to try to better understand others. Because narrow-mindedness is the inability to see other perspectives or to even try, right? So, moving on to the next page. Of course, this is an important paragraph. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with the men of medicine as well as with the men of religion. Here again, context is so important. In many ways, AA mirrored the times. These men, while to us they seem like maybe racists or misogynists, were, for the time, somewhat progressive. Women had only been given the right to vote 16 years before, remember? And again, this was written and segregation was still upon the publication, segregation was still 25 years or so from its end, at least as far as the Constitution is concerned. And I want to reiterate that this is not an excuse for the failures of these men, so much as it is to remind you that perspective really matters. Having this perspective has not made me fall in love with the book or to view it as the final word on the treatment of alcoholism, but it has helped me to read it all. And even just reading it as a piece of history, I think, is important if you're an alcoholic. There are things in this book worth noting and steps worth taking, but that's way more difficult if every other word makes you bristle. Old-timers sometimes say, you can't just take the best and leave the rest. Meanwhile, they do that when they pluck out all the God stuff and ignore the cognitive behavioral therapy aspects. In any case, I think in the case of this book, you can take the best and leave the rest, at least to some degree. So now I'm going to move into the doctor's opinion, which, is great because we needed to have the medical community behind us to some degree. They had been failing mostly to sober up the alcoholic. They didn't really have the answers. We still don't to some degree. I mean, certainly medical science has come, especially psychiatry, has come a long way. And there are incredible medications to deal with anxiety and depression and OCD and PTSD, and a lot of the reasons we drink to medicate those very things. But there is nothing to show that those are a cure for an alcoholic. And it's kind of like diabetes. You can get your blood sugar down and you can get a good A1C and you can be in remission or recovered from it. But at any point, if you overeat sugar, it could come back and come back with a vengeance. So to date, we don't really have an answer to the can I have just one, unless people are willing to try having just one. And that's proven a faulty test at best, since a lot of people don't come back to recovery after that. So it was important, especially for the time when there was a lot less seriousness about addiction. People didn't look at it as a medical problem. A lot of society, and some people still do, look at it as a weakness of character. Now, I honestly believe there is an element of self-will, which they disagree with wholeheartedly in this book. I think that willpower is important, as it is with any change. We need to exert some strength to get through each day, especially in the beginning. But these days we have more things to help us. Anyway, going on to the doctor's opinion. It is worth noting because we needed it. Dr. Silkworth writes, he's the writer of this letter, if you move on to the second page of it. We doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics, but its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. What, with ultra-modern standards, our scientific approach to everything, we are perhaps not well equipped to apply the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. Now note here, I think his words are very carefully chosen. He writes the powers of good, not of God. Take that as you will. I see the powers of good as unselfishness of the alcoholic who is willing to help another alcoholic. Not God, but humanity. Not a miracle, but action. I think that's important. So that's the kind of if you're not reading along with me, or you want to do more reading on your own, that's an example of the kind of I would like you to use when reading, if you're struggling, if you're agnostic, or if you're atheist, to help clear away some of the clouds of anger you may feel. A careful reading will reveal much more. And I don't know for sure, but I think that fundamentalists don't always necessarily do a careful reading, or their perspective, they want God, they want that to be the center of the program. It sort of blurs their vision. Okay, moving on to the next page I have highlighted. The paragraph begins, "We believe, and so suggested a few years ago." We believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. These allergic types can never safely use alcohol in any form at all, and once having formed the habit and found they cannot break it, once having lost their self-confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. So this is the essence of step one. This is what you're hopefully coming in on into AA. When I read this now with a clear head and without overwhelming fury at Bill, I think we still don't know the entire diagnosis of any one addiction, although we know it's not merely an allergy. But if we stick to the notion of it as an allergy, then we can safely say that God does not relieve anyone of her allergies any more than God gave her allergies. Most of us do not seek help for our tree pollen allergies in church. We seek it in a doctor's office. The doctor will give us some things to use in the hay fever war, but those alone are not always enough. I don't know about you, but I don't think anyone takes a Benadryl and then hits the floor to pray for more supernatural antihistamines. But what most people do, or so I think, is find other things to help. For some, that may include prayer for health and well-being. Fine. But it can also mean taking a steamy bath with eucalyptus oil, cleaning your AC ducts. Benadryl and a prayer does not allergy relief make. So I hope that's clear. I just think that today we have more information on science, and we can do things to medicate with non-addictive substances, some of the things we were medicating with alcohol. The phenomenon of craving is not as much a phenomenon today as it was. We understand the brain centers that are lit up, so to speak, by alcohol or by drugs in various addictions, and that when those centers of the brain are lit up, the brain wants to light them up again and again and again and again and again because it feels so good. And while right now the medication differs and is very unique person to person, I don't see why in the next decades we won't have something that more accurately addresses that. But we have so many things that are working on that are stopping the brain connection here, that are like, I don't know really how to put it in the simplest terms, but that are sort of blocking the transmitters that are telling our brain, this is so great, we got to have more. That's not to say there'll ever be a cure for addiction. I don't know that. I just think that, I sort of think there will be one day, or at least we'll be better able to address it addict to addict. And I say that, and I still don't think there's any reason to drink. I'm not a pious or holier than thou sort of teetotaler now, but the more I think about it, the further I get away from it, the more dangerous it really seems to me. It is so scary, even for the normal drinker when she gets like incredibly shit-faced. Like, it's a scary poison, and the way you feel from a hangover, no matter what, is bad. On average, it doesn't make anyone's life better unless they have just one when they get home as sort of a relaxer. But again, like, the longer I'm on the planet, the more I wonder, why is this legal, like, when all these other things aren't? And it seems to me more poisonous than some of them. Okay, last page of the doctor's opinion, and then we'll finish up with episode 2. It's the last 3 paragraphs that I think are important. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called, quote, moral psychology, unquote. And we doubted if even that would have any effect. However, he did become sold on the ideas contained in this book. He has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is a fine specimen of manhood, as one could wish to meet. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through and through. Perhaps he came to scoff. He may remain to pray. So the alcoholic problem does seem so complex and the depression so great. And I actually think moral psychology is in big part the answer. And in truth, I think that's what this book is giving you. So you can take God out and just say this is giving you a sort of framework for life. Maybe there are lessons you didn't learn about how to treat other human beings and how to treat yourself, and you can find them here. Maybe you knew all that, but it's been lost in the muck and mire of addiction. I don't think you have to have God. I mean, they talk later about this being, Dr. Jung talks to Roland Hazard, and that's another part of the history, about a spiritual experience and a complete change of the mind. But that doesn't have to be supernatural. That is just like willing to let go of old ideas and change them and maybe try to perceive the world differently. And the last sentence, he may remain to pray, I just read that as he may remain to listen. So you may come in and think, ugh, this is never going to work. I don't join groups. I hate being a part of. And maybe that's true, or maybe that's something you've told yourself because it's easier to feel different from if you tell yourself that. But stay to listen. Just stay to listen. And I promise you'll find a way.